Hello, everyone. I'm Genevieve Daquitaine. I'm a deputy registrar for the University of Atlantia and the instructor spotlight coordinator. And this month we have the amazing Doña Mariana Ruiz de Medina. And she's going to be talking to us about participating in the Persona Pentathlon, which is a competition the Order of the Laurel hosts once a year at our Kingdom Arts and Science Festival. And she was this year's winner, which is very exciting. It's always a fun competition to see. And so we look forward to her insights. So take it away, Mariana.
Hello, my name is Doña Mariana Ruiz de Medina, and welcome to Participating in Persona Pentathlon. In this class, we're going to go over what is Persona Pentathlon, how I planned for my entry at Kingdom Arts and Sciences in 2024, the research process that I used, execution and display tips for anybody looking to participate in Persona Pentathlon, and how to reach me if you have any questions on the process. So for starters, what is Persona Pentathlon? I'm going to read this one word for word because it is the actual definition of the competition, but Persona Pentathlon is an annual competition sponsored by the Order of the Laurel. The pentathlon requires 5 separate items that a single persona would have used or owned. There are 7 different categories of entry items, and 3 of the 5 items must be from different categories. There is also a youth version called the Youth Triathlon. It only requires 3 items, but does not have the different category requirements. All 3 items do still need to be from the same persona, though. Those categories include manuscript and fine arts, so bookbinding, calligraphy, drawing, etc. Garb and fiber arts, so beadwork, clothing accessories, hats, and any sort of like knitted work or embroidery. Category 3 is glass and pottery, so ceramics, enameling, glass blowing, etc. Category 4 is medieval life, which is where we categorize cooking and brewing and dyeing and, the day-to-day items that a person might need. Category 5 is performance related and writing. So this covers poetry, song, musical performance, but it also covers research papers as well. Category 6 is metal, leather, wood, and other hard arts, including armor, chainmail, and blacksmithing. And category 7 is miscellaneous. And this is kind of defined as heraldic display, subtleties, and really anything that doesn't just fit it neatly into another category. So to reiterate, you have to choose 5 items covering a minimum of these 3 categories. You can have multiple items from the same category. You don't have to choose 5 from different categories, but at least 3 do have to be from different item categories. So the planning process that I went through for my submission was kind of a 5-stage process. First is picking persona. The second is finding what I call an anchor piece. Step 3 is building out the entry around that anchor piece. 4 is preliminary research, and 5 is planning the timeline. So the important things to know about picking a persona for this entry is you do have to have the same persona for all 5 of those items, but it does not have to be the one you play all the time. My persona in the SCA tends to be float between 15th and 16th century Spain, and that is the persona that I chose for my entry, but I know somebody who ended up doing an Egyptian entry, and their persona has nothing to do with Egypt in the past. It just has to be cohesive and actually genuinely be all for the same persona. And I would recommend, if you're going to do something that is not your usual persona, pick something that you are interested enough to spend a lot of time on, because this is going to be an extensive project. So finding an anchor piece. First, what do I mean by an anchor piece? So for me, an anchor piece on a display is a central piece of that display that either acts as a visual interest anchor, so something to bring somebody into the display and make them want to come look at your work. If we're using this definition, mine was probably the set of shoes that I will show later on in this presentation. An anchor can act as a stylistic inspiration or guide for the other pieces. So if you've decided on an item that you really want to make that requires other supplementary items to actually make it work, that would be a stylistic inspiration piece. If we're using that as an example, mine would probably have been this jacket called a gonete. The last kind of anchor piece definition I have is a unifying thematic element to build your entry around. And this is actually what I ended up going with for my display. My anchor piece was really my commonplace book, which was kind of born out of a different project and led to wanting to know how my persona would have been educated. And that item sort of defined both the place and the time of the rest of my entry, and everything else sort of fell in around that. So there's a couple of different ways you can kind of pick that anchor. The first one I'm affectionately calling grabby hands, which is you see something in a piece of artwork, in some research that just absolutely fascinates you and you want to have the thing. Something you have always wanted for your kit but never really had a reason to make. And Pentathlon is going to push your creative skills and your creating skills. This is an excellent opportunity to try that pie in the sky project. The next kind of way I think about it is a rabbit hole. So something that absolutely fascinates you that you really want to go deep into. Pentathlon is the time when you really want to show your chops on your research and execution. So this means choosing items that are really compelling to you to want to learn everything you possibly can about them. And lastly is the new novice. Is you could choose a category of art or science that you've never tried before. And this might be a controversial take, but I actually think pentathlon is a fantastic time to try new things. Statistically, very few of us are going to have 5 entirely separate categories of arts and sciences objects that are equally well developed. If we do, those 5 categories may not make sense as a cohesive entry. So the odds are, no matter what you end up choosing, you're going to try something that you've never tried before in doing Persona Pentathlon. And finding that as kind of your be really excited about this, use it as an anchor piece can be a great way to incorporate that into your project planning. Once you've chosen your anchor piece, you can build out your entry. And to do this, I like to ask myself a series of questions. Are there any items I considered choosing for my anchor piece that I didn't choose but still want to make? So as we discussed, my anchor piece really was my commonplace book, but I have wanted this little jacket for as long as I have known that this little jacket existed. And so and when it happened to line up with my commonplace book, this was a great opportunity to add that as my second item. The next question you ask yourself is, do any of my items need or benefit from a specific other item? In the case of this little jacket, the answer is yes. Because in going through my research, I kind of came to the conclusion that this would not have been worn with my usual go-to structural garments. And so I needed something that I could wear with it. Whether or not that is actually a correct conclusion, I'm still working on, but that ended up becoming, maybe this jacket was worn with this specific style of skirt. So can I make that specific style of skirt, which is called a vasquinha? And then in the research for putting those two together, I noticed that the women were wearing a lot of these fascinating, wonderful shoes called chapines. And so those were my next 2 items. The next question that I ask is there an art or a science form that I'm particularly comfortable with? And I know I just said that this is a great time to try new things, but this is also a very big project. And during this process, you're going to be pushing yourself a lot. Having something that you know you are already confident in your ability to research and execute gives you a safety net to allow you to push yourself to try those new things. So I recommend choosing at least one item that you know is going to be a slam dunk for your skill sets. For me, that was food. So I made a recipe as my 5th item. The next question is, once you kind of have an idea of what those items are, can you tell a reasonable story connecting your entry items? Is there, justification for all of these items to have belonged to the same person? People apparently with pentathlon used to write, stories or letters or ways of tying their pieces together to show judges how a cohesive entry might have actually been built out. For me, I ended up writing a letter from my persona to a friend. I didn't end up actually presenting it because I'd run out of time to do it as nicely as I wanted it to. But by articulating something that, my persona could have just sent at some point to her friend, it helped me see how each of those pieces connected together. And last but not least, if none of these questions have helped really guide you to an answer, is there anything that just tickles your fancy? Is there something that sounds fun to do? This may be a competition and this may be a competition at a very high level, but it is still supposed to be fun. Step 4 is preliminary research. Do not skip the preliminary research. What do I mean by preliminary research? I mean, once you have identified things that you might want to do, it's really important to see if those are even logical or feasible. Can you find adequate quality of research sources to support the items that you want to make? Do you have an idea of how you might approach the individual project planning for each of those items? Do you have an idea of what materials you might need? Are those materials and any tools necessary feasible for you to make or acquire? Did the items you picked actually match up with the persona that you thought they did and with each other in the way that you thought they would? Do not skip this step, because if you skip this step, you'll end up getting super far into something you're really excited about and realize that, this is actually about 100 years off of where I need it to be. Or the materials for this are astronomically expensive or very dangerous, but you're already, committed to making that item. And it can be hard to pivot once you get that far into the process. But it is really important to be able to start planning what that process looks like and being able to figure out how you might do that pivoting. So I like to start my project planning as well with establishing how long I think each item is going to take. This is kind of a visual representation of how I like to think about it, is they're all buckets of work. Which one is the really big bucket? What is the really small bucket? And how are you going to balance those? A couple of tips is work backwards from your intended submission date and maybe consider that the immediate next pentathlon may or may not be feasible. I thought my entry would probably take me a year to do. It ended up needing 2 due to life events and multiple iterations of several of my items. Budget in buffer time, because things will go wrong, inevitably. The more time you allow yourself to make adjustments, the more flexibility you allow yourself, the easier those things going wrong is going to be to cope with, and the more fun this project is going to be long term. And last but not least, and this is one I did not consider as well as I probably should have, is research time is project time. That means when you're planning your timeline, you need to make sure that you have a good idea of how much research time you've allowed yourself. There's going to be a lot of reading, a lot of note taking, a lot of writing and editing, and all of that is a time cost to this process that you have to allow yourself. So the research process. This is not a documentation class as a whole, but good research and documentation practices are going to be vital to the success of your pentathlon entry, as is occasionally algebra and learning that you may or may not know how rectangles work as well as you thought you did. So tips just that are at a high level specifically for pentathlon is take good notes and do it from the moment that you decide that pentathlon is something that you want to do. This is likely to be a long or involved process, and record keeping is vital to its success. Research first and make second. This is generally just sound A&S advice, but critical for competition entries. You don't want to invest in materials, make something, and then find out that none of the available research supports your choices. Make your creative decisions intentional and supportable by doing the desk work first. Also, don't forget to include historical context, and this will help you decide on your research and materials and processes. It's really, really tempting to take the excitement of wanting to make something and just hit the ground running. This is not the project to do that on. Process documentation. However, process documentation works best for you, make sure you are doing this. For me, it's spreadsheets, and I tend to keep spreadsheets not just of my individual sources and any data that I'm using to actually support my research, but also timesheets. Comprehensive written and picture documentation will be your best friend. The judges want to see it, Your documentation will go so much smoother for your process documentation if it's just turning notes into paragraphs instead of having to remember everything you did from scratch. And you get really interesting data points like how long each process took, or the time and materials costs for your project as a whole. Execution and display. Again, I've got a several phase process to this. The first is entry development, which we've just spent time talking about, and preliminary research. From there, I tend to move into a period of doing some in-depth research before I start making items. This is kind of a visual representation of how my process worked. I started on an item that I had already done a lot of research on for other classes, etc. I had all of the background that I already needed for this recipe. Recipes for me are iterative, so I would not say that this took as much of the time as this visual seems to indicate. It was in little spurts, allowing people to taste test throughout the process. But it gave me the time to start working on something that I knew I could do well, and give me the time to do the in-depth research on everything else. The next item I started was the item that I knew would take the most time. Is I tried to knock out that research first so that I could get started working on that in little spurts, because it was going to be a monumental task. And then you can, work through the rest of your items however makes the most sense. Some of this making will happen concurrently and not constantly. Some projects, like the commonplace book here, would be insurmountable to do in a single sitting or stretch. That commonplace book has 447 entries in 4 different languages, only one of which I speak. There is no way I was just going to sit down and actually do that as a whole. So I broke that up a lot and do a little bit a day for a long time. Some projects will end up being your sole focus, like the choppiness down here. This is not really a great visual representation because these took all of my time for the time that I was working on. But it's important to allow yourself time to budget for both methods of little bits of work at a time and sole focus time. Holding yourself accountable to this process is really important. However you do that, great, as long as it works for you. For me, I have my SCA website and blog, and I have a rule of no matter what happens that month, I publish a blog post about my month and the work that I've accomplished that month. This is also great for documentation purposes because it helps me, go back and I can find little bits and interesting pieces on that process and pictures, and it helps with that detailed documentation that I like to do. The next phase is documentation. And this should be a somewhat ongoing process. Starting with the research notes, planning a rough intended course of action for making each item to make sure that your process mirrors your research is really, really helpful in my mind. Then I try to focus on the process documentation of how did I actually make it? How long did it take? What went right? What went wrong? What materials did I use? And that should occur throughout the process of making an item. Materials documentation should also occur throughout. I like to do a materials breakdown and an explanation of deviations from period practices, just to keep myself accountable to I understand how this should be done, but this is why I had to do it differently. And then once your items are fully made, that's when I tend to sit down and do the actual paper writing part of my documentation. So I'm taking all of those notes and putting them into a much more cohesive document instead of the chaos that is outline format. In that documentation section, I also like to include a future learning opportunities or next project section, because it can be a great way to show people that you are thinking critically about your growth as an artisan. Next is display prep, which we'll go into a little bit more depth by looking at this display. So this is what my final display looked like. This is the dish that I made. These are the shoes. This is the commonplace book. And you're not seeing the jacket and skirt on the table because I was actually wearing them that day. So a couple of things to consider when you are putting together a display is making sure that you have some amount of visual interest. So varying heights of things can help that. Having a visually interesting piece right in the center, having something that smells really good from a mile away, All of those bring people to your table and make them want to see and talk about what you have worked on. The other thing to consider is how are certain items best presented versus best judged. So as I said, my 2 garments were not on the table for the day. I wore them. So my logic here was I have some fairly challenging measurements for a standardized dress form. And at the time, I didn't have one of my own that was like formed to my body and my needs that I could use to show these items in their intended use case, which is on my body fitting me. The trade-off that you get in wearing this and showing off the quality of the fit is that it can make it more challenging for judges to actually judge the item. So making sure that you're really upfront with contest coordinators, like, look, this is how I think this item is going to show off best. I acknowledge that this could be a challenge. Here's how I'm going to address that and make sure that the judges are comfortable with judging my item, is a great way to go. So a couple of other things to point out on the actual display itself is alternatives to long form documentation. Not everybody is going to come to your table and actually be able to read the large amounts of documentation that happen for this kind of project. Like my documentation was cumulatively 77 pages long. That's a lot of reading. So I like to recommend having short form or executive summaries on the table that will give just your average passerby a quick summary of, what is this item and why did you choose it, or what category is it in, etc. The next is if you're presenting food, food safety matters. I'm going to get on my soapbox on this one for a little bit. If you are bringing food to be shared, you need to be very conscious about the challenges and dangers that can present. If you're bringing hot food, figure out how you're going to keep it hot. If you're bringing cold food, figure out how you're going to keep it cold. Make sure it is not exposed to the environment. And make sure that it is adequately labeled for any potential allergens. So what we've got here is a chafing dish with the sample versions of the food that I made, signage that says, please don't touch this, I will serve you, an example of how it should be plated with a sign that says, please don't eat this, it is not temperature controlled, and serving cups that I could give to people and control access to the actual item so that nobody was just having blanket access and like bugs and other people and stuff couldn't get to it. The next thing to think about is the actual presentation of your longer format documentation. This was just something I enjoyed doing for this, but it's a nice point of professionalism. You can send your documentation into UPS and get it printed and saddle bound on nice paper. It's great for maintaining your image quality. It's great for maintaining your colors. And the bonus is after that, you can bring this really nicely printed documentation to a bunch of other like events more easily if you want to display this more than once. The caveat there, and we're going to hop over here for a second, is having multiple access points to that information. There are a lot of judges that will pass through. There are a lot of people that will pass through. You cannot just have one copy of your various documentation papers. So I like to bring a couple of extra printer-friendly copies, meaning no pictures in them, in case people want to read or judges want to judge simultaneously. And for the average passerby, I like to have a QR code to that documentation available as well. That'll allow people to read on their phones if they want, or read it later. You can also bring your SCA business cards and pass it out that way. And the last thing is if your item has hidden materials or any like auxiliary tools, it can be really fun to bring them and show them off at this stage. So the shoes tend to be really fascinating to people and they want to pick them up and handle them. And they're always fascinated like, what are they built around? So I brought one of the pieces of cork that these are built around, and it lets people actually see the inside of items that they can't otherwise take apart and dig into. So there was a lot of signage on that table, but there are a couple of things that I like to do for each of my signs, is making sure the item name is on all of the signs that are relevant to that item. The item category can be really helpful for pentathlon as well, just to remind people that like, hey, these are the categories that I'm in. Having your persona reminder for persona related competitions, also really helpful. And then the text of your signage. So there's a couple of things that you could put here. You could have an introductory sign introducing who or what the persona is being displayed and guiding a viewer through their interaction with that persona. The other option is executive summaries, which describe what the item is, any major sources that support it, and very briefly its historical context. Any pictures for inspiration pictures or stylistic guides, or providing visual context for your entry items. QR codes to help people access your documentation in different formats and concurrently. And any safety information if there is an item that you need handled a specific way, if you don't want people touching an item, if an item or tool or material could otherwise be harmful to participants if it were mishandled, etc., signage is a great way to do that. And once you've got your display all together, it's time to actually put it up and go through the judging. There are a minimum of 2 judges per item and ideally 3 judges per item. This is really important because that's a lot of judges. There were 3 people that competed total this year, and that with 5 items each. So you're looking at, 30 judges just for 3 people, probably more. That is a lot of time that people are going to be putting into judging your work. It's a lot of time that organizers are going to be put in to finding those judges, and being cognizant of the quantity of judging that is going into this can be really important. You want to give them the tools to succeed at that. It's also really important to take a look at the rubric because it's slightly different than our standard Atlantean ANS rubrics. There are 5 categories: documentation, authenticity, complexity, workmanship, and overall impression. All of them are scored 1 to 10, from I want to say 0 to 10 or 1 to 10, and some of them have multipliers to weight that category more heavily, to bring it to a total of 100 points per judge per item. So one thing to note here that's really interesting is, where are those multipliers? This tells you a lot about what's genuinely important in participating in pentathlon, and that is documentation and workmanship, followed by authenticity. So what does this say about the competition in general? It means that the research and your actual creating is what's most important, followed by your I don't necessarily want to say the word commitment to that research, but your connection from those items to that research. It does not have to be the most complex thing in the world. The skirt that I made is a fairly bog standard trapezoidal skirt, but in doing so, it keeps it more authentic. It matches the documentation, and you can do really fine workmanship on very not so complex things. Just keeping this rubric in mind can be really helpful in where you're allocating your time when planning to do this. Last but not least, I really like to do rudimentary score analysis after I've received competition pieces, is seeing, what your weakest items were, what your strongest items were, same with categories. And it gives you really great guidance for where to focus growth in the future. Also highly recommend scan all of your judging sheets. Each sheet leaves judges a lot of space for commentary, and I think it's incredibly valuable for long-term learning to be able to take that commentary and actually put it into practice. So, best advice overall in this process is, throughout this process, you are going to be challenged as an artisan, and it can be very easy to want to kick yourself over your mistakes. Acknowledge them, learn from them, and grow from them, but don't dwell on them. Mistakes are part of learning and are part of making. Support systems, I firmly believe all artisans need one. Whether this is your capital P peer or your lowercase peers and friends, having people that you can go to as a sounding board, as moral support, for parallel work, and for sanity checks will seriously help you throughout this process. Also, editors. Everyone needs an editor, whether they think they do or not. Have somebody else read your documentation at least once. And lastly, don't let this be a one-time deal. And I don't mean you have to go and compete in this competition more than once. But one of the things that I think stood out the most to me in my experience with this is feeling really proud of the work that I did, but also being kind of terrified that that work was a fluke and that it would take me 2 years to do that quality of work ever again. Be thinking about what you want to do with everything you learn in this process, and don't let the knowledge and skills you gain during doing it be a one-time thing. Um, you're going to learn a lot during doing pentathlon, and you're going to grow as an artisan. And I really encourage you to let that growth take you into your next projects after pentathlon. Thank you so much for your time. I am always reachable and can, be that sounding board and that sanity check for anybody who wants to. I also highly recommend reaching out to the competition coordinators for pentathlon if you have any questions on the actual logistics of participating. But everybody should try it at least once, or anybody that wants to try it at least once should try it at least once. Thank you so much.